We are now in the home stretch to the Oscars, my friends. With another couple Guild Awards handed out last weekend, we now have an even better idea of who might win the 2023 Academy Award for Best Picture. In the next few minutes, I'll be predicting this year's Oscar Best Picture winner using my Best Picture point system, which I discussed in my last video. Definitely check that out if you want to learn about the major data variables that indicate a Best Picture winner. Before we dive into my prediction, I wanted to walk you through a few tweaks I made to the point system based on what a couple of you pointed out in my last video. And the best way to explain them is to map out how the last few weeks of award season plays out, starting with today, March 3rd, 2023, and where we want to go, which is obviously the Oscars on the 12th of March. For reference, Oscar voting started here on March 2nd, but ends in a couple days, here on March 7th. Those are the big dates to remember, and here are some other awards that stir things up right before the Oscars. The BAFTAs were held recently on February 19th, and like the Oscars, their voting members are also industry only. The key difference is that the BAFTAs have more non-American industry members, which might not have been important before, but as the Academy continues to diversify and invite more members outside of America to vote, the BAFTA's Best Film is starting to become another good indicator of Best Picture, and therefore should definitely be factored in. Moving on to last weekend. On February 26, we had the Screen Actors Guild Awards, which I mentioned in my last video as being an important variable in my point system. But what I forgot to mention was that the Producers Guild of America Awards were also last weekend on the 25th of February. The PGA Best Theatrical Film Award is not only, like the SAG Awards, right before the Oscars voting window, but it's also the only other major award in the film industry to have preferential balloting, which we all know is pretty hard to predict. So, the PGA's is almost like a trial run for the Oscars Best Picture, but on a smaller scale with only producers. But still, it does start to show us how preferential balloting might play out in the Academy Awards. Lastly, a few of you also mentioned that I had neglected to put in any writing awards, which is a completely fair point. And this is where the Writers Guild of America Awards come into play, because interestingly enough, that ceremony is this weekend, on March 5th, which happens to fall within the Oscars voting window. It's important to add the Writers Guild perspectives, specifically the Original and Adapted Screenplay Awards, because recent Anomaly Best Picture winners, Green Book and Coda, won the Oscars for Best Original and Adapted Screenplay, respectively, before going on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. I know the WGA is not the Oscars, but it does indicate what films might win Best Screenplay awards at the Oscars, which will then hint at what film could also win Best Picture that year. These are all the most relevant awards before the Oscars for two main reasons. The first of which is that these awards I've highlighted are voted on by the industry, with lots of guild members overlapping with Academy voting members. And these awards happen weeks and days before the Oscars, so winning those guild prizes and making those headlines will undoubtedly influence the last few votes for Best Picture before the voting window closes. With these new variables in mind, I've updated my point system to include 4 more possible points: films winning the BAFTA for Best Film, the PGA Award for Best Theatrical Film, and the WGA Awards for Best Original or Adapted Screenplay get 1 point for each award. Now, finally, we are ready to predict the 2023 Best Picture winner. Except with a slight caveat that we don't have the full set of current data, because if you've been keeping track, the Writers Guild Awards are happening this weekend, so we won't know who wins Original and Adapted Screenplay. But for this year, as you will see, it doesn't really seem to matter anymore, because it's pretty clear which film is going to win Best Picture this year. So, without further ado, here are the allocation of points for all the 2023 Oscars Best Picture nominees, with the highest number of points being the most likely to win Best Picture this year. And, probably to no one's surprise, it's looking pretty likely that Everything Everywhere All at Once will win Best Picture in 2023. But what's interesting is when you look into the data points themselves and factor in audience scores and timing. In my last video, I talked about using Rotten Tomatoes scores to determine how crowd-pleasing the film was. I hadn't mentioned the exact percentage that indicates a high score on Rotten Tomatoes. But after some careful thought and from applying the model to this year's movies, I personally believe that a high rating is anything above 90% for both the critics and audience scores. I know a 90% threshold seems really high, but I mean, we are talking about the best movie of the year, so 90% makes sense because we're talking about the best of the best. If you look at the data, only 2 films have above 90% for both critics and audience scores, and the 2 films are All Quiet on the Western Front and Top Gun, which both of them aren't even frontrunners of the Best Picture race this year. But if it was a tighter Best Picture race, this is one variable that could just tip a crowd-pleasing film that arguably isn't most people's best film of the year, all the way through to the top of the preferential voting rounds, and then go on to win Best Picture just because it's well-liked enough. The last thing I want to point out is how the DGAs, PGAs, and SAG Awards have recently affected the Best Picture race. If we look at the points before these ceremonies, it was pretty neck and neck between the Banshees of Inisherin, All Quiet on the Western Front, Tar, and Everything Everywhere All at Once. But it was only after winning the top prizes at the DGAs, PGAs, and SAG Awards that Everything Everywhere All at Once has become the frontrunner. And on top of that, according to The Hollywood Reporter, only one film in the past 27 years has won all 3 top Guild prizes and not won Best Picture at the Oscars. So I'm definitely not saying it's a sure thing that Everything Everywhere All at Once will win Best Picture, but it looks pretty close to a sure thing. Still, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which film the Academy chooses as Best Picture, because film is subjective, and it's always more interesting to see what everyone else thinks should win instead. So, as a small experiment, I want to do my own version of Best Picture preferential voting. Tell me how you rank the Best Picture nominees, and I'll run some numbers right before the Oscars. If you're interested in participating, fill out the form in the comment below, and I'll post the results right before the Oscars. Thanks for watching, and as always, if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on more spiels in the future.